Hi there, welcome to Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, the safest podcast on the internet. My name is Joshua Bissell, and I'm the editor of this weekly podcast, where we tackle topics around safety with a focus on vulnerable sector protection and abuse prevention. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast, where we're going to be talking about power differentials.
Hello. Well, today I am recording my podcast from my bedroom. A week ago yesterday, I was exposed to COVID. So, for the protection of my children and my family and my office staff, I have locked myself away in my bedroom for the past week. Today, I'm looking outside at a beautiful snow-covered reservoir, and I am reminded of the beauty that is outside the window after a snowfall. Sometimes we can groan when it snows. Sometimes we can look at the snow-covered trees, which I am looking at right now, and reminded of the beauty. But there has also been a lot of damage that has been done to the reservoir this past year. 2 beavers cut off our walkway and built up quite the dam and have really destroyed the walk that we so often would go on down into the reservoir. And it is covered by snow and ice and a lot of swamp because of the beavers. They have taken down quite a few trees. You may wonder why I'm telling you this story about these 2 beavers and the damage they have done. Well, this past month on our podcast, Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, we've been talking about harassment and power differentials. And I promised you that today we would talk and go through a few case studies and also touch briefly on spiritual harassment. I was brought up in the church. My father was a preacher. My father was an elder in different churches that we attended. I married my husband, Scott, and soon after, Scott became a pastor. So I spend a lot of time when I'm not in my office at Plan to Protect in the church. And I love the church. I love the church a lot. I find great joy in my faith. I don't question the existence of God. I put my faith in God when I was just a young child. And it often breaks my heart when I see the church making really bad decisions and destroying what should be really beautiful. Similar to my beautiful reservoir that we often would go and hike in and walk through. 2 beavers have caused quite havoc and really have destroyed such a beautiful area now. Those of you who are naturalists probably love the thought of the beavers building a dam. And yes, I have gone down and visited the dam a number of times. But those beavers have also taken down quite a few trees and have destroyed some of the beauty of my backyard. That can happen in the church too. And unfortunately, it wasn't hard for me to find some case studies about harassment that has happened within the church. And I think some of these case studies of harassment, and many of them have to do with both emotional harassment and also sexual harassment. But there's also a very strong element in these case studies of spiritual harassment. So I just want to speak to this important issue because I think that the church really needs to consider the damage that can be done if they do not approach issues of harassment correctly, and if they don't take every accusation and allegation of harassment very seriously. I'm not going to repeat some of the content from the other podcasts, but I am going to speak to this issue of both spiritual harassment and some of these case studies that have been brought to mind over the last couple of years. I first want to start off with just a few verses in Titus chapter 2, verse 7 and 8. And we read Paul writing to Titus. He said, "In everything set them an example by doing what is good. In your teaching show integrity, seriousness, and soundness of speech that cannot be condemned, so that those who oppose you may be ashamed because they have nothing bad to say about you." I wish that was true. I wish that the world could say nothing bad about the church. But unfortunately, that is not true in so many cases. In James chapter 3, verse 1, we read, "Not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly." And then in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 to 4, the Apostle Peter said, "To the elders among you, I appeal as a fellow elder and a witness of Christ's sufferings, who also will share in the glory to be revealed. Be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, watching over them, not because you must, but because you are willing, as God wants you to be, not pursuing dishonest gain, but eager to serve, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade." This past month, we've been talking about power differentials. And certainly, as I said, in school, in the workplace, in the home, and yes, even in the church, there are power differentials. And I have grown up with those. I grew up in a church where not only were children not to be heard, but only seen, women were also told not to be heard, that women were to be silent in the church. And that's a church community that I grew up in. And today I find myself in a different church community that recognizes and ordains women and do provide women the opportunity to be elders and deacons and even pastors. And I appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity for women to come to the table and to speak their mind. And I think that's what I am doing here today is I'm telling you how much it grieves me that we do have to do abuse prevention. We do have to write policies and procedures. I wish that we were a holy people. I wish that we could be above reproach, but I even know in my own life that there have been many times in my own life that I have failed and I have exerted power and authority when I shouldn't have. There were times that, yes, it was called for, but I know that there are times when we often use power, authority, influence, and control to manipulate individuals. And I think we all need to do a lot of navel gazing and see if we are like the beaver that is destroying some of the beauty around us. So today I want to speak to those of you who are in church leadership for just a moment. For those of you who serve on elders boards and deacons boards, for those of you who are in pastoral ministry or are ministry leads within your departments, for those of you who are employers, it is so easy for you to cross the line and abuse that power. And that is why there's so much written today about servant leadership and to follow the example of Jesus, who was a servant leader. And when I think of women who were caught in the act of adultery or who were being stoned or who were being judged so harshly, and what Jesus did is he allowed them not only to serve them by anointing his feet with oil and perfume, but he also challenged the religious leaders and he said to them, "Those of you who are without sin, cast the first stone," because none of us are without wrongdoing in them. Now, I say that because earlier in my life, I know that if there was a woman who was caught in adultery or caught in sexual sin, especially if it involved a church leader, that she would often be criticized for being the temptress and being the one who was responsible. But in 2020, that is so different than how the world views this today. As the world views this today, we see power differentials and we see how easy someone in a position of leadership can exert that power and cause havoc, just like those beavers do in my backyard, and how easy someone can be led to be infatuated with someone in a position of leadership. I think of one case study that involved a very popular pastor in the States. And it came out a few years ago that one of the young people in his youth group, when she was 16 years of age, was being driven home by her youth pastor, who was single. He was driving her home from a youth event, and he stopped his car on the way home, and they engaged in sexual behavior. And as soon as it was finished, he felt remorse. He got out of his car, he started crying, confessing what he did, recognizing what he did was so wrong. And he had no interest in this 16-year-old. He used this as an opportunity to manipulate her and to be sexually satisfied by her. But immediately he recognized what he did was wrong. And I'm sure she went home probably also feeling some guilt, but also wondering if he was attracted to her, and quickly learned that he was not, and that he wanted to distance himself from her. She went and brought it to the attention of leaders within the church, and they told her they would take care of it, which they didn't do. She continued to raise concerns about what had happened, admitting what had happened, and reporting on the accusations or the actions of this staff member. They dismissed him from his role as a youth pastor. They let him resign and they moved him on to a different church. And over the course of the next 20 years, this pastor did disclose both to his wife and other church leaders where he went to of his indiscretion. The young woman came out with her story in the midst of the Me Too Church Too, and it was brought to their attention and to the world's attention that he is a famous pastor in the United States. The Sunday it was disclosed in the media, he got up in front of his congregation and he admitted what he had done and the steps that he had done. We often are asked the question at Plan to Protect, well, doesn't God forgive? And shouldn't we show grace and forgiveness of others? And my response to that is there are always consequences to our behavior. And it doesn't mean that you have to be out of service, but there are some roles that you should not serve in once you disclose that you have crossed the line with a minor. And in this case, he had crossed the line with a minor. He was well over 18 years of age at the time the occurrence had happened. She was a minor, and there are long-term consequences to that. And no, he should not continue to be a pastor. He should not be preaching. He should not be serving in a role where he is a role model to others when there are individuals like this young woman who has had to bear the scars of being abused as a minor. So that is one example of harassment, sexual harassment. And then, yes, probably 20 years ago, it would have been handled exactly as it was in this situation. But today, in 2020, it cannot be handled that way because there's so much more teaching and awareness today than there was 20 years ago about power differentials. Was it a power differential 20 years ago? Absolutely, it was. It was a power differential. And instead of moving from church to church, admitting his error, he should have accepted the consequences that he breached what is considered a crime. I think what concerns me most about this situation is when he got up in front of the church and he admitted what he did, and he had told his congregation that he had confessed what he did. The congregation applauded. They applauded him for confessing. We should never, ever applaud someone for confessing their sins. We should join them in weeping. We should do as King David did, and that is go out and weep because of sin and sin that affects the church. So I think the one takeaway from that case study is there are long-term consequences to crimes, especially if it involves a minor. And I also believe it is so critical that we do not applaud when someone confesses their sin. Rather, we weep because of this kind of infraction. The next case study I want to talk about relates to one that has just recently been in the news in the last 2 years. And it is one that I have referenced in the past, but it is of two women that thought that they were having an emotional relationship with their pastor. It had happened to two women in the same congregation, and they ended up seeking their pastor for counseling, and he treated them as if he was engaging in a very intimate relationship with them through text messages, through phone calls, through emails. It was only after one admitted it to the other that she was in a relationship with her pastor that they both discovered that they were both in a relationship with the same pastor, and he was married. When they tried to bring this to the attention of church leadership, they were told that they were not believed. They were told maybe they should go to a different church. They were disciplined and ignored and not believed. And they ended up taking it to media. Case studies like this are very disheartening to hear. This pastor really crossed lines that he never should have crossed. Emotional affairs can be as damning as sexual affairs are, and one can also often lead to another. This case study reminds me of how important it is for us to take every allegation seriously and not to compound the pain that has already occurred by telling individuals maybe they should go to a different church, that it's best for them to go to a different church and not to be believed. It's almost like what happens in situations like this is gaslighting, where something can occur and it can just continue to compound, just like a snowball rolling down a hill, that it picks up steam and it picks up greater size. I hope that what we have learned during this month of talking about power differentials and sexual harassment is the damage that it can occur, and that we must take this seriously, and we must always look at where the power lies and how can we silence that power if it is used not to serve each other. We do not need to protect God's reputation. God can handle that completely on his own. I think that when something goes wrong, instead of trying to move so quickly past that, and I've often talked about this very issue, how we like to take the bad stories and the errors and the mistakes that have been made in the past, sweep them under the carpet, and try to move on as quickly as we can. And we say, together, let us join together so we can move into the future. There are times that we need to sit silently among the pain. We need to sit silent with the victims. We need to really look at ourselves and say, how did I contribute to this story? What can I do different next time? Who do I need to apologize to? What wrongs do I need to make right? I am a big believer that God wants us to expose wrongdoing. He wants us to expose wrongdoing in the church, at the workplace, in our schools, and our camps, and in our families. One of my favorite verses in Psalms is, "Search me, O God, and know my heart, and see if there be any wicked way in me." We cannot use our power, our authority, our influence and control to silence people. Wrongs need to be righted. What we need to do is sit silent and be teachable and be a servant. I trust this series of harassment has been beneficial for you. I trust that I have challenged you as you have considered the whole topic of power differentials. The case studies I talked about today, yes, they're true case studies. They're in the news. They've been on media. Some of them you might recognize. Unfortunately, there's too many case studies. I only picked 2 today. But whether it is a case study you recognize or whether it is a case study that you've never heard about, there are case studies that are out there of harassment within the workplace and within the church. And we need to really look at where there are imbalances of power and give voice to victims and provide a safe environment for individuals who have been harassed, either sexually, emotionally, or spiritually, to come forward and tell their stories. Again, today's podcast has been sponsored by our Policy and Consulting division at Plan to Protect, and it has been sponsored by our Crisis Response and Management course. I really want to encourage you to take that course by Barry. Barry did most of the teaching in this module. It's just excellent. Every organization and church should have a few of their key leaders and board members take the course, Crisis Response and Management. If you would like our help in reviewing your policies, in registering for one of our courses, please reach out to us at info@plantoprotect.com. Thank you very much. Goodbye.